Hi everyone, my name is Monica Kelly. I was assigned chapter 5 from B.F. Skinner book. And this was all about perceiving. The first part or section of this chapter really talks about the perceiver or the receiver. So Skinner basically starts out by saying we act because what we receive from the environment, not because of what is happening internally. I really like this quote that he had said right at the beginning. The initiating action is taken by the environment rather than the receiver. So he gives an example to kind of explain this of an image in your world, in the physical world, that enters through your eye, your retina, and it transforms into a perception. He then posed the question, what becomes of this stimulus? He believes that it stays where it is, which is outside of the body, in the environment, where it always was. In the next section, he talks about stimulus control of operant behavior. So to start, he says the outside world or the environment that you're in affects the being, the individual, both before and after it responds to it. So the main focus of this whole section was talking about how there's a consequence added to the stimulus and the response. So when the behavior and the consequence occur, they're interrelated to the reinforcement of that stimulus. So when the stimulus is presented, the response becomes reinforced by the consequence, and now it has control over that response. So that means it's going to most likely happen again because it was reinforced. So the stimulus is a control. He then goes over a term called generalization. He explained that when the response is reinforced, it's highly likely that it's going to occur again in a similar situation. So you as an individual are generalizing that response and that reinforcement to other situations, hoping for the same outcome because you were reinforced by the first situation. He also said if the stimulus is only reinforced when a certain thing is present, it's now called discrimination. So a little bit different than the generalization. He goes on to say that behavior is not stimulus bound, meaning that it is not controlled by the current setting, rather than the environmental history is in control, and the genetics of the individual play a part into it as well. And the contingencies that are present also determine what's going to be received by the individual. Those all play a big factor in it. Skinner says that perception is is intentional, and he gives the example of a person. Person isn't just an indifferent spectator, just kind of soaking up the world. He used an example. I really like this example. It made a lot of sense to me, about a passenger in a car. Sometimes my roommates and I carpool to work or to a new restaurant or things like that. So when you're the passenger in the car, you might be a passenger in the car pretty frequently. The driver is probably paying more attention. Now, if you were to switch roles and suddenly you become the driver, you probably won't be able to find your way as easily as the driver of the car did, because you were probably not paying attention as the passenger. You could have been on your phone, looking out the window, things like that. So the stimulus control of that passenger was low. They're not able to acquire those things as quickly and easily. So I really like that example. I thought it made a lot of sense. Kind of a real life situation that we all could be in every day. The next section that this chapter talked about was experience versus reality. This was also super interesting to me. It starts out by saying there are great differences in what is seen by different people at different times. And it talks about how behaviorism, some people say, is at fault for ignoring how situations look differently to different people, and how people interpret situations differently. So some people think that behaviorism completely ignores that, but I'm going to try to explain kind of how this section talks about the physical world and how our mind differs from what the physical world actually might be. The question was asked and posed in this chapter: were the qualities of images and ideas found to be in nature at all? There was a really well-known example that was used in this. If a tree falls in the woods, doesn't make a sound if no one heard it. I'm sure you've heard that before. It's pretty well known. He says that this whole issue isn't a problem for behaviorists to worry about, because people see things different when they've been exposed to different contingencies of reinforcement. So he said it's kind of irrelevant, and to not worry about it. The next section talks about what's called the copy theory. So to summarize this, some people think that we only see copies of the world, not in its true form, not in the real world. This was explained through visual stimuli, auditory, taste, texture, and odor. I thought this was really interesting because it makes you think more about what we're seeing and feeling rather than what we're perceiving. So when you see your reflection in a mirror, is that a copy of it or is that the real world? Things like that. When you hear back music versus live, is that a copy of it or is it the real world? So it's a really, really makes you think about what you see and hear every day. The second to last section in chapter 5 talks about seeing in the absence of the things seen. Took me a second to kind of like digest what that meant. I really had to like think about it as I was reading, think internally. So it posed a really interesting point. If a person is dreaming or engaging in a fantasy or something like that, they are not under control of a stimulus. Are they seeing a copy? So it really made me think, like, you have dreams every night. Some people have fantasies, things like that. So to kind of answer this question that he posed, he pointed us to environmental history. An example was when you hear a song a bunch of times, your favorite song, something new that comes out, you start to hum it. You start to hear the song in your head, even though the song isn't playing. You're doing in the absence of its presence. So the music is still happening in your head, even though it's absent. So that stimulus is not there, but you're still hearing it. Skinner explained that seeing in the absence of the things seen can be familiar to almost everyone. I'm sure everyone's kind of experienced that at some point in their life. Another example that was posed was when you go on this really great vacation, this really great trip. He talked about Venice. you come home, you're reinforced by the beauty of it. You really enjoyed it. It was a really reinforcing trip for you. When you come home, you might want to look at pictures of it. You read about it, you daydream about it, things like that. You are doing in the absence of its presence. You're kind of reinforced by that stimuli, so you are creating it again in your mind. And the last section actually does talk about the mind and stimulus control. The mind can be considered as the person who acts, which he talked about in chapter 4. But he also says that it can stand for the person who perceives. And an example of this was when somebody is out of touch with reality, they're absent, their mind is considered to be wandering. Another thing that he touched base on was when the mind is used as a verb, it simply means to respond. So when you go in somewhere with a low ceiling, somebody says, mind the ceiling, so you don't hit your head. So it could be used as a verb as well. And additionally, he said that the mind can also be the place in which things are seen. And the example that I didn't really understand at first, but then I read this example, things come to mind. It's a place for you. When things come to mind, I had that in my mind to remember for later. Things like that. He said, Skinner says that because the mind is a place that's perceived, the mind is closely associated with the copy theory, which kind of makes sense to me. So the question I'm going to pose to you all is, can we trust ourselves, our minds, our senses, all of those things to perceive the physical world as it is? Or are we interpreting it in our own way? Do we think it's a copy, or is it reality and the physical world? So I'm really interested to see what you guys think, and let me know if you have any comments or any extra questions. Thank you.